For 31 years, Eleanor Hayes believed she knew everything about her husband. She knew how he took his coffee in the morning. She knew he hated driving in heavy rain. She knew he always checked the front door twice before going to bed. She knew the name of his first employer, the story of how they met, and even the little song he used to hum while working in the garden. What Eleanor didn't know was that her husband had another life. She discovered it 3 weeks after his funeral. It began with something so ordinary that she almost ignored it. Eleanor was cleaning the bedroom closet when she found an old brown envelope tucked behind a box of winter clothes. There was no name on the front, only a date written in faded blue ink. March 14th, 1998. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her husband's. Daniel Hayes had always kept old documents, but Eleanor had never seen this envelope before. She opened it expecting to find an insurance paper or an old receipt. Instead, she found a photograph. Daniel was standing outside a small house. He looked younger, perhaps 30 years old. But he wasn't alone. A woman was standing beside him. And in her arms was a little girl. Eleanor stared at the photograph for almost a full minute. She turned it over. On the back, Daniel had written only 4 words. My other family. Eleanor felt the room suddenly become silent. She looked at the photograph again. The woman wasn't familiar. The child wasn't familiar. And yet Daniel's expression in the picture was something Eleanor had never seen before. He looked completely at peace. She sat down on the edge of the bed. For 31 years, she had believed she was the only woman Daniel had ever built a life with. Now she was holding proof that she might have been wrong. There was another photograph inside the envelope. This one was taken several years later. The little girl was older. Daniel was standing behind her with both hands on her shoulders. Written underneath the picture was a name. Sophie. Eleanor whispered the name to herself. Sophie. Then she noticed something else. A small piece of paper had been folded behind the photograph. She opened it. It contained an address. Nothing more. Eleanor recognized the town immediately. It was nearly 4 hours away from their home. She had never heard Daniel mention it. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the woman in the photograph. Who was she? Why had Daniel hidden her? And most importantly, why had he continued hiding this family for more than 3 decades? The next morning, Eleanor called her husband's closest friend, Arthur Miller. Arthur had known Daniel since before Eleanor met him. She showed him the photograph over the phone. There was a long silence. Too long. Arthur? He finally answered. Where did you find that? Eleanor's heart sank. You know who they are. Arthur didn't respond. Arthur, please. He sighed. The woman's name is Rebecca. Eleanor closed her eyes. And the girl. Another pause. Sophie. Was she Daniel's daughter? Arthur's voice became quiet. Yes. Eleanor felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. Why didn't you ever tell me? I promised Daniel I wouldn't. A promise. He wanted to tell you himself. Eleanor looked at the photograph. Then why didn't he? Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he said something that frightened her even more. Because every time Daniel tried to tell you, something happened. What do you mean? I think you should go to that address. Eleanor stared at the piece of paper. Why? Because Daniel left something there. What? Arthur took a breath. The truth. That afternoon, Eleanor drove 4 hours to the address. It led her to a quiet neighborhood filled with old trees and small houses. She stopped in front of a pale yellow home. For several seconds, she simply sat in the car. Then she walked to the front door. Before she could knock, the door opened. A woman in her late 50s stood there. Eleanor immediately recognized her. It was the woman from the photograph. Rebecca. They stared at each other. Neither spoke. Then Rebecca looked at the photograph in Eleanor's hand. Her expression changed. You finally came, she whispered. Eleanor's voice trembled. Who is Sophie? Rebecca looked toward the hallway. She isn't here. Where is she? Rebecca looked back at Eleanor. She left this morning. Where did she go? Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. To find you. Eleanor froze. To find me? Rebecca nodded. She knows who you are. Eleanor couldn't breathe. Rebecca stepped aside and let her enter. Then she said something Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. Daniel didn't leave you for us. Eleanor looked at her. He left us because he believed you were in danger. Eleanor remained standing in the doorway, unable to understand what Rebecca had just said. Daniel had spent 31 years beside her. They had raised children, celebrated birthdays, survived difficult years, and grown old together. Yet now a woman she had never met was telling her that Daniel had once believed Eleanor was in danger. What danger? Eleanor finally asked. Rebecca looked at her for several seconds before stepping away from the door. Come inside. The house was quiet and strangely familiar. There were old photographs on the walls, books stacked beside the fireplace, and a wooden cabinet filled with family pictures. Eleanor noticed something immediately. There were several photographs of Daniel. Some were from the late 1990s. Others were from the early 2000s. He wasn't visiting this house occasionally. He had been part of their lives. Rebecca noticed Eleanor looking at the photographs. He came here almost every month, she said. Eleanor turned around. Every month. Rebecca nodded. He never stopped caring about Sophie. Eleanor felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Then why did he stay with me? Rebecca looked down. Because he loved you. That answer somehow hurt more than anything else. Eleanor sat down. Then tell me everything. Rebecca took a deep breath. Daniel and I were together before he met you. Eleanor looked at her. We weren't married, Rebecca continued. But when I became pregnant, Daniel wanted to marry me. Then something happened. What? He received a letter. Rebecca walked toward the cabinet and pulled out an old metal box. She opened it carefully. Inside were several letters tied together with string. Daniel's father had been involved in a business dispute. There were people trying to recover money from him, and Daniel discovered that someone was using his name to cover financial problems. Eleanor listened silently. Daniel thought the matter was over, Rebecca continued. But then threats started. Against Daniel? Rebecca shook her head. Against me and Sophie. Eleanor's expression changed. So Daniel left? He believed that if he stayed with us, whoever was behind it would keep looking for us. Rebecca handed her one of the letters. The paper was old and yellow. Eleanor recognized Daniel's handwriting. The letter was dated only 2 weeks before Daniel met Eleanor. I have to disappear from your life for a while. If I stay, they will find you. I promise I will come back when it is safe. Eleanor's hands began to shake. Did he come back? Rebecca nodded. But not the way you think. She explained that Daniel eventually met Eleanor and built a new life. But he never completely abandoned Rebecca and Sophie. He secretly sent money, visited them, and watched Sophie grow up from a distance. Eleanor couldn't believe it. All those years. He wanted to tell you, Rebecca said. Many times. Then why didn't he? Rebecca looked toward the window. Because the danger never completely disappeared. Eleanor stared at the letter. What happened to Sophie? Rebecca's expression changed. She found out about you when she was 16. How? She found some of Daniel's old letters. Eleanor looked up. What did she think? She hated him at first. Then she understood why he had stayed away. Rebecca sat beside her. Sophie always wanted to meet you. Eleanor swallowed. Did she ever? Rebecca shook her head. Daniel wouldn't allow it. Why? Because he was afraid that anyone connected to him could put you in danger. Eleanor looked at the photograph again. So why did you say Sophie left this morning to find me? Rebecca hesitated. She found something. What? Rebecca walked back to the cabinet. She pulled out a small notebook. This belonged to Daniel. Eleanor recognized it immediately. She had seen it many times in his office. I thought he had lost it years ago. Rebecca opened the notebook to the final page. There was a short message. If Eleanor ever learns about Rebecca and Sophie, tell her the truth. The danger is no longer in the past. Eleanor read the sentence twice. What does that mean? Rebecca didn't answer. Instead, she opened another page. There was a recent date written at the top. Only 3 months before Daniel died. Underneath it was a name. Marcus Vale. Eleanor frowned. Who is Marcus? Rebecca looked at her. The man Daniel spent the last year of his life trying to find. Eleanor suddenly remembered something. During Daniel's final year, he had started receiving phone calls late at night. Whenever Eleanor asked who was calling, he always said it was work. She had believed him. Now she wasn't so sure. Did Daniel ever tell you what Marcus wanted? Rebecca nodded. He believed Marcus had found the old financial records. What records? The ones that could prove who had been behind the threats all those years ago. Eleanor stood up. And where are those records now? Rebecca's face became pale. I don't know. Then how does Sophie know where to look? Rebecca looked toward the front window. She doesn't. Eleanor followed her gaze. A car was parked across the street. It had been there when Eleanor arrived. And now the driver was watching the house. Rebecca whispered. That's the same car I've seen outside my house for the last 3 weeks. Eleanor's heart began racing. Do you know who it belongs to? Rebecca shook her head. Then Eleanor's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. There was a message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. You should never have gone to Rebecca's house. Eleanor slowly looked up. Rebecca was staring at her. And both women realized the same thing. Someone knew exactly where Eleanor was. Eleanor kept staring at the car parked across the street. The windows were dark, making it impossible to see who was inside. Rebecca quickly closed the curtains. "Don't stand near the window," she whispered. Eleanor stepped back. "Who is Marcus Vale?" Rebecca shook her head. "I don't know much about him. Daniel never told me everything. But he was searching for him." "Yes." "Why?" Rebecca took a slow breath. "Because Daniel believed Marcus knew what really happened all those years ago." Eleanor looked at the old notebook again. "What happened all those years ago?" Rebecca opened another drawer and pulled out a small envelope. "Daniel left this here 6 months before he died." Eleanor opened it. Inside was a photocopy of an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Local businessman disappears after financial dispute." Eleanor read the article carefully. The missing businessman wasn't Daniel. It was a man named Peter Lawson. Rebecca pointed to the bottom of the article. Peter worked with Daniel's father. Eleanor frowned. "And?" "Peter was the last person to speak to Daniel before he disappeared from our lives." Eleanor looked confused. "Daniel disappeared from your life?" "Not physically," Rebecca said. "He left town for several months. When he came back, he was different. He told me he had discovered something about Peter." "What?" Rebecca looked toward the window again. "I don't know." Suddenly, a car door slammed outside. Both women froze. Someone had stepped out of the vehicle. Rebecca turned off the lights. Footsteps approached the house. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat. The footsteps stopped outside the front door. Then came 3 quiet knocks. Rebecca whispered, "Don't answer." The knocking came again. This time, a man's voice followed. "Rebecca, I know she's inside." Eleanor looked at Rebecca. "Who is that?" Rebecca's face had gone completely pale. "I don't know." The man spoke again. "Eleanor, you need to leave before this gets worse." Eleanor stepped toward the door. Rebecca grabbed her arm. "Don't." But Eleanor pulled away. She wasn't going to spend the rest of her life being afraid of people she didn't even know. She opened the door. The man standing outside was in his early 60s. He wore a dark coat and held an old leather folder. Eleanor had never seen him before. But he knew her name. "Who are you?" The man looked at Rebecca. "My name is Samuel Reed." Rebecca immediately stepped into the hallway. "You shouldn't be here." Samuel ignored her. He looked at Eleanor. "Daniel asked me to find you." Eleanor's heart skipped. "When?" 3 months before he died. "Why?" Samuel opened the leather folder. Inside was another photograph. Eleanor took it. It showed Daniel standing beside a much younger Samuel. Behind them was the same yellow house where Rebecca now lived. On the back of the photograph, Daniel had written, "If anything happens to me, Samuel knows where the records are." Eleanor looked up. "What records?" Samuel's expression became serious. "The records that prove your husband wasn't living 2 separate lives because he wanted to." Eleanor felt confused. "Then why?" "Because he was trying to protect you from someone who is much closer than you think." Rebecca closed her eyes. "Samuel, stop." He turned toward her. "You kept the truth hidden long enough." Eleanor looked between them. "What truth?" Samuel handed her a second envelope. "This is the last letter Daniel ever gave me." Eleanor opened it. The letter was short. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, I am probably no longer there to explain everything. Please don't blame Rebecca. She didn't destroy our marriage. She helped me protect it. The person you need to fear isn't someone from my past. It is someone who has been part of our family for years." Eleanor's hands began trembling. Someone from her family? She immediately thought of her children. Then her brother. Then Daniel's closest friends. She looked at Samuel. "Who?" Samuel hesitated. "I don't have enough proof." "Then give me the name." Samuel slowly looked toward Rebecca. Rebecca shook her head. "Don't." Samuel finally said, "Your husband's younger brother." Eleanor's face went blank. Michael Hayes. Her husband's younger brother. The man who had stood beside her at Daniel's funeral. The man who had called her every Sunday since Daniel died. The man who had told her more than once that she could always trust him. Eleanor suddenly remembered something. The night before Daniel died, Michael had visited their house. They had argued. Eleanor had heard raised voices from the study. But when she asked Daniel what happened, he had simply said, "It's nothing." Now she realized it had never been nothing. Samuel suddenly looked toward the street. "The car is moving." Rebecca rushed to the window. The vehicle was gone. Then Samuel's phone rang. He answered. His face changed immediately. "What happened?" Eleanor asked. Samuel slowly lowered the phone. They found Sophie. Eleanor's heart stopped. Where? Samuel looked directly at her. She never made it to you. A long silence filled the room. Then he added, she was taken before she reached this town. Eleanor felt the room spinning after Samuel's words. Sophie was taken? Samuel nodded. When? Yesterday evening. Rebecca immediately covered her face with both hands. She was supposed to call me when she reached the bus station. Eleanor looked at her. Why didn't you tell me she was coming? Because I didn't know if you were safe. Eleanor couldn't believe what she was hearing. Sophie is my husband's daughter. If she's in danger, I need to know everything. Samuel opened his leather folder again. There may still be time. He pulled out a folded map. Sophie was traveling from the city by bus. She got off at a small station about 20 miles from here. According to the last message she sent Rebecca, someone was following her. Who? We don't know. Samuel pointed to a location on the map. Her phone was last detected here. Eleanor recognized the place immediately. It was an old roadside motel. The same motel where Daniel had once stayed during one of his mysterious business trips. She looked at Rebecca. Did Daniel know about this place? Rebecca nodded slowly. He used to meet Sophie there when she was younger. Eleanor felt another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Then that's where we go. Samuel shook his head. Not yet. Why? Because if someone took Sophie, they may be expecting us to look for her there. Eleanor looked at him. Then what do we do? Samuel took out an old key. This was given to me by Daniel. Eleanor stared at it. What does it open? A storage room at the old railway station. Rebecca suddenly looked frightened. Daniel told me never to go there. Why? Because that's where everything started. They drove to the abandoned station just before sunset. The building looked even older than Eleanor remembered. Broken windows, faded signs, and weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. Samuel unlocked a side door. Inside was a narrow corridor leading to several storage rooms. They entered the last room. It was almost empty. There was only an old wooden table and a metal cabinet. Samuel opened the cabinet. Inside were dozens of files. Eleanor recognized Daniel's handwriting on several of them. She pulled one out. The first page contained a list of names. Peter Lawson, Marcus Vale, Michael Hayes, Rebecca Turner, and finally, Daniel Hayes. Eleanor stared at the names. What is this? Samuel answered quietly. Daniel had been investigating the people connected to the financial scheme. Was Michael involved? Samuel didn't answer. Eleanor turned toward him. Tell me. Samuel sighed. Daniel suspected Michael was involved, but he wasn't sure. Eleanor's heart sank. Then why did he write his name here? Because Michael was the person who knew where Daniel kept the original records. Rebecca suddenly pointed toward the bottom drawer. There. Inside was a small cassette recorder. Samuel pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room. If you're listening to this, I've run out of time. Eleanor closed her eyes. Daniel continued. Michael knows about the records. He doesn't know where I've hidden them. If he finds out, he'll try to destroy everything. The recording paused. Then Daniel said something that shocked Eleanor. Rebecca and Sophie are not the reason I kept Eleanor away from the truth. They are the reason I survived long enough to protect her. Eleanor opened her eyes. The recording continued. There's one person I never suspected until the very end. The tape became distorted. Daniel's final words were barely audible. It's not Michael. Then the recording stopped. Everyone stood silently. Eleanor looked at Samuel. What does that mean? Samuel shook his head. I don't know. Suddenly, Rebecca's phone rang. She answered. Her face changed. Sophie? Nobody spoke. Rebecca listened for several seconds. Then she slowly handed the phone to Eleanor. A woman's voice whispered from the other end. Mom? Eleanor's heart stopped. Sophie? Yes. Where are you? I don't know. Eleanor's voice trembled. Are you hurt? No. But you need to listen carefully. Sophie began crying. The person who brought me here says they know the truth about Dad. Who brought you? There was a long silence. Then Sophie whispered. Uncle Michael. Eleanor's eyes widened. But before she could ask anything else, another voice came onto the phone. A man's voice. Michael. Eleanor, if you want Sophie to come home safely, bring Daniel's original records to the old station. The call ended. Eleanor stared at the phone. Samuel immediately said, It's a trap. I know. Then why are you going? Eleanor picked up Daniel's old notebook. Because my husband spent 31 years protecting this family. She looked at Rebecca. I'm not letting his daughter disappear too. Then she noticed something written on the back of the cassette recorder. A single sentence in Daniel's handwriting. The The person you trust most will bring you to the truth. Eleanor suddenly realized the recording had not ended by accident. Daniel had deliberately stopped before revealing the final name. Someone in that room already knew the answer. And Eleanor was beginning to suspect it wasn't Michael. Eleanor returned home that night with Daniel's notebook still in her hands. She had barely spoken during the drive. Michael's voice kept replaying in her mind. He had Sophie, he knew about the records, and he wanted Daniel's original documents. Everything pointed toward him. Yet Daniel's final recording had said something different. It's not Michael. Eleanor couldn't ignore those words. Samuel placed the cassette recorder on the kitchen table. Daniel knew someone else was involved, he said. Rebecca looked exhausted. Then who? Eleanor didn't answer. She was thinking about the sentence written on the back of the recorder. The person you trust most will bring you to the truth. Suddenly, she remembered something. Daniel had always trusted Arthur Miller. Arthur had been his closest friend for more than 40 years. He had helped Daniel with business matters, attended family celebrations, and even helped Eleanor after Daniel died. But there was something else. Arthur had known about Rebecca. He had known about Sophie. And he had known about Daniel's fear long before Eleanor did. Eleanor immediately called him. He answered on the second ring. Eleanor. Arthur, I need to ask you something. What is it? Did Daniel ever tell you about the original records? There was silence. Eleanor's heart sank. Arthur? He finally said, why are you asking me that? Because someone has Sophie. Arthur's breathing changed. Where are you? I asked you a question. Another silence. Then Arthur quietly said, don't go to the station. Eleanor looked at Samuel. Why? Because that's exactly where they want you. Eleanor's voice became firm. Who? Arthur didn't answer. Arthur, tell me. He finally whispered, I think I know where Sophie is. Eleanor stood up. Where? An old house outside Millbrook. Why would she be there? Because Daniel used it. Eleanor froze. What do you mean? Daniel kept a second set of records there. Samuel immediately leaned forward. Do you know the address? Arthur gave it to them. Before ending the call, Eleanor asked one final question. Arthur, did Daniel ever tell you who he was afraid of? Arthur hesitated. Yes. Who? I'll tell you when you get here. The call ended. Eleanor looked at Samuel. Something isn't right. Samuel nodded. They drove to the old house just after midnight. It stood alone at the end of a narrow road, surrounded by trees. There were no lights. No cars. Nothing. Samuel checked the front door. It was unlocked. They entered. The house smelled of dust and old wood. Then Eleanor heard something. A faint sound from upstairs. They moved carefully toward the staircase. A bedroom door was slightly open. Eleanor pushed it. Nobody was inside. But on the bed was a photograph. It showed Daniel, Rebecca, Sophie, and Eleanor. All four were standing together. Eleanor stared at it. I've never seen this picture. Rebecca took it from her. This was taken the day Daniel planned to tell you everything. When? 20 years ago. Eleanor turned the photograph over. A message was written on the back. One family. 2 lives. One final truth. Suddenly, a noise came from downstairs. They rushed back. The front door was open. Someone had entered the house. Samuel ran outside. Nobody was there. But a small envelope had been left on the doorstep. Eleanor opened it. Inside was a key and a note. You are looking for Sophie in the wrong place. Rebecca began crying. Then where is she? Eleanor looked at the key. She recognized it. It was the same kind of key Daniel had kept in his old desk. Samuel examined it carefully. This is for a safety deposit box. Eleanor's eyes widened. Daniel had one? Arthur had never mentioned it. Neither had Michael. Neither had Rebecca. Then Eleanor remembered something. After Daniel died, Arthur had helped her organize his financial papers. There had been one missing document. A bank statement. She had assumed it was unimportant. Now she realized it might have been the most important document of all. Eleanor called Arthur again. This time, he didn't answer. She tried again. Nothing. Then her phone received a message. Not from Arthur. Not from Michael. From an unknown number. Stop trusting the people who claim they loved Daniel. Eleanor looked at Rebecca. Then Samuel. And suddenly she understood why Daniel had never told her the full truth. The danger wasn't just one person. It was a chain of people who had all protected the same secret. And somewhere inside that chain was the person who knew exactly where Sophie was. Eleanor couldn't stop staring at the message on her phone. Stop trusting the people who claim they loved Daniel. She read it again, then locked the screen. I'm going to the bank, she said. Samuel looked at her. Now, yes. If that key opens Daniel's safety deposit box, Whatever is inside may tell us where Sophie is. Rebecca grabbed her coat. I'm coming with you. They drove to the bank just before closing time. Eleanor had brought Daniel's death certificate, the old key, and every document she could find. The bank manager checked the records and confirmed that Daniel had rented a safety deposit box for more than 25 years. Eleanor's hands trembled. Did he ever access it recently? The manager checked the computer. 3 months before his death. Eleanor looked at Samuel. That was the same period when Daniel had started receiving those late-night phone calls. They were taken into a private room. The manager unlocked the box and stepped away. Inside was a small black folder, a sealed envelope, an old photograph, and a second key. Eleanor picked up the photograph first. It showed Daniel standing beside Arthur. But behind them was a building Eleanor recognized. It was the old family business. On the back, Daniel had written, Arthur knows where the first account was opened. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Arthur. Samuel opened the black folder. Inside were bank statements dating back more than 30 years. Several accounts had been opened under different names, but every account had one connection. Money had been transferred through them before eventually reaching an account controlled by someone named Michael Hayes. Rebecca stared at the papers. So Michael really was involved. Samuel shook his head. Maybe. Look at the dates. Eleanor checked them. The transfers had started before Michael had even joined the family business. Then she noticed something. The person authorizing the transfers wasn't Michael. It was Arthur Miller. Eleanor felt sick. Arthur had been moving the money. But why? She opened the sealed envelope. Inside was Daniel's final letter. Eleanor, if you've reached this box, then you already know that Arthur was involved. But don't make the mistake of believing he was the person behind everything. Eleanor's eyes moved quickly across the page. Arthur helped me hide the money because I was trying to recover it. The person responsible had access to every family account. I suspected Michael, but I was wrong. She stopped. The next line was underlined. The person responsible is someone Eleanor trusts more than anyone. Rebecca looked at her. Who does that mean? Eleanor couldn't answer. She thought about her family. Her children. Her sister. Arthur. Michael. Then one person came to mind. Someone who had been beside her during every difficult moment after Daniel's disappearance. Someone who had helped her pay bills. Someone who had visited her every week. Someone who had even helped organize Daniel's funeral. Her hands began to shake. Celeste. Rebecca looked confused. Your sister. Eleanor nodded slowly. But she was with me when I found the first letter. Samuel looked at the documents. Then maybe she wanted you to find it. Before they could continue, Eleanor's phone rang. It was Celeste. Eleanor answered. Where are you? Celeste didn't respond immediately. Then she whispered. Eleanor, please listen to me. Where is Sophie? A long silence. I can explain. Where is my husband's daughter? Celeste began crying. She isn't with Michael. Eleanor stood up. Then who has her? Celeste's voice broke. I do. Eleanor's heart stopped. What? I didn't hurt her. I swear. I took her because I knew someone else was looking for her. Where are you? I can't tell you over the phone. Celeste, there is something you need to understand. Daniel didn't disappear because of the money. Eleanor looked at Samuel. Then why? Celeste whispered. Because he discovered who your father really was. Eleanor froze. My father. Celeste continued. Daniel found records proving that your father's old business was connected to the entire scheme. He realized the secret wasn't about his family. It was about yours. The call suddenly ended. Eleanor stood motionless. Samuel looked at her. What did she mean? Eleanor didn't know. But then she looked at the second key from the safety deposit box. There was a number engraved on it. 214. She suddenly remembered something from her childhood. Her father had owned a storage unit numbered 214. It had been closed after his death. Eleanor had never opened it. Until now. She looked at Samuel. I think I know where Daniel hid the final evidence. And somewhere else in the city, Celeste was sitting beside Sophie, waiting for someone to arrive. Someone who had been searching for that evidence for decades. Eleanor had spent most of her childhood believing that storage room 214 contained nothing more than old furniture and boxes belonging to her father. After his death, the unit had been locked and forgotten. She had never had a reason to return. Now, 20 years later, she stood outside the same building with Daniel's key in her hand. Samuel looked at her. Are you sure you want to open it? Eleanor nodded. If Daniel went to all this trouble, there must be a reason. The key turned easily. The metal door opened with a long, painful creak. Inside were dozens of cardboard boxes covered in dust. Old business records filled one corner. There were photographs, account books, and several locked briefcases. Eleanor walked deeper into the room. Then she noticed a wooden box sitting alone on a shelf. Her father's name was written across it. George Hayes. She opened it. Inside was a collection of letters. The oldest one was dated 1987. Eleanor began reading. Her father had written about a business partnership that had gone terribly wrong. He had trusted a man named Leonard Cross, who had promised to help expand the family business. But Leonard had secretly been using the company to move money through different accounts. George had discovered the truth. He wanted to expose Leonard. But Leonard threatened him. Then Eleanor found something that made her stop breathing. Her father's records mentioned Daniel. Not Daniel's business. Not Daniel's family. Daniel himself. A note from George said, "Daniel knows about Leonard. He believes the truth will eventually reach Eleanor." Eleanor stared at the words. "So Daniel knew my father?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Apparently." She opened another file. Inside was a photograph of Leonard Cross. Beside him stood a much younger Arthur Miller. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Arthur wasn't just Daniel's friend. He had been connected to the original business scheme from the beginning. But there was something else. At the bottom of one document was another signature. Celeste Hayes. Eleanor froze. Her sister had been involved too. Suddenly, everything became clear. Celeste hadn't taken Sophie because she wanted to hurt her. She had been trying to protect her. But that still didn't explain why she had hidden the truth for so many years. Then Eleanor found a final letter. It was written by Daniel. "Eleanor, if you ever discover the history of your father's business, you will understand why I stayed away from you and Rebecca. The people involved didn't disappear. They simply changed their names and waited." Eleanor turned the page. The final paragraph contained only one sentence. "Leonard Cross is still alive." Samuel looked at her. "That's impossible." Eleanor shook her head. He wouldn't have written it if it wasn't true. Then she noticed an address beneath the sentence. A nursing home. The name listed beside it was different. Edward Collins. Samuel immediately searched the name on his phone. His face changed. "Eleanor." "What?" "Edward Collins owns the house where Celeste is staying." Eleanor's heart dropped. They immediately left the storage unit. As they drove toward the address, Eleanor called Celeste. This time, she answered. "Eleanor, where is Sophie?" "She's safe." "Who is Edward Collins?" Celeste went completely silent. Eleanor's voice became firm. "Celeste, tell me." Finally, her sister whispered. "It's Leonard." Eleanor closed her eyes. "Why is he with Sophie?" "He wants the records." "Then why hasn't he taken them?" "Because he doesn't know where they are." Eleanor looked at the old documents on her lap. "He knows I'm coming." "Yes." "Then why are you still there?" Celeste's voice began to shake. "Because I can't leave." "Why?" "Because Leonard knows something about Daniel's final days that you don't." Eleanor's heart raced. "What?" Celeste whispered. Daniel wasn't the only person who disappeared. The call ended. Eleanor looked at Samuel. "What does she mean?" Samuel didn't answer. They were only minutes away from the house. Then Eleanor noticed something inside the old file. A photograph had fallen out. It showed Daniel standing beside Leonard Cross. But Daniel wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking toward someone standing just outside the frame. Eleanor turned the photograph over. There was one final handwritten message. "If Leonard ever returns, ask him who was with Daniel the night he died." Eleanor's hands went cold. Daniel hadn't simply disappeared from her life. Someone had been with him during his final hours. And that person might have been the one who had been hiding the truth all along. Eleanor and Samuel reached the house just before midnight. The front door was open. Inside, the lights were on, but the house was strangely quiet. "Celeste?" Eleanor called. No answer. They moved through the hallway until they heard a voice from the room at the back of the house. "Eleanor." She stopped. Leonard Cross stepped into the doorway. He was an old man now, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, but Eleanor recognized him from the photograph. Behind him stood Celeste. And beside her was Sophie. Eleanor's eyes filled with relief. "Sophie." Sophie immediately ran toward her. Eleanor hugged her tightly. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Eleanor looked at Leonard. "You destroyed my family." Leonard shook his head. "No. I only gave people reasons to destroy themselves." Samuel stepped forward. "Where's the evidence?" Leonard smiled. "You already found it." Eleanor looked confused. He pointed toward the folder in her hands. "Your father kept everything." Eleanor stared at him. "You knew Daniel?" "I knew him very well." "Were you with him before he died?" Leonard became silent. Eleanor stepped closer. Answer me. Finally, he said. Yes. Her heart sank. What happened? Leonard looked toward Celeste. She can tell you. Celeste began crying. I was there. Eleanor froze. You? Celeste nodded. The night Daniel died, he called me. He knew Leonard had returned and that the old records were being searched for again. Why didn't you tell me? Because Daniel asked me not to. Eleanor's voice broke. Why? Because he knew someone was watching our family. Celeste explained that Daniel had suffered a sudden medical emergency that night. He knew something was seriously wrong and gave Celeste instructions about the records. He told her to protect Eleanor and Sophie. Then Daniel made her promise something. If Eleanor ever discovers the truth, Celeste whispered, tell her that he never stopped loving her. Eleanor closed her eyes. For the first time, the anger she had carried since Daniel's death began to fade. All those years, she had believed her husband had chosen another family over her. But the truth was different. He had been trying to protect everyone. Leonard had spent decades manipulating people through fear, money, and secrets. Arthur had helped hide the records. Michael had become involved because he believed he could recover the money and repair the family business. Celeste had hidden the truth because Daniel had trusted her with his final request. Nobody had told Eleanor the truth. Not because she wasn't loved, but because everyone believed she needed to be protected from it. And that had caused its own kind of pain. Eleanor turned toward Leonard. Why did you do all of this? Leonard looked tired. Your father found out what I had done. Daniel found the evidence. I spent years making sure nobody could connect me to it. And now? Leonard looked at the files. Now I'm too old to keep running. Samuel quietly called the authorities. Within minutes, the house was surrounded. Leonard surrendered without a fight. The investigation that followed finally uncovered the full history of the financial scheme. Old accounts were traced, missing records were recovered, and the people who had helped Leonard were forced to answer for their actions. But for Eleanor, the most important discovery wasn't the money. It was a small letter she found among Daniel's belongings. It had been written only days before his death. Eleanor, if you ever find out about Rebecca and Sophie, please don't think I was living a life without you. You were my life. Rebecca was part of my past, and Sophie was my responsibility. But you were the person I chose to grow old with. I know I should have told you everything. I was afraid that the truth would hurt you. I was wrong. Sometimes hiding the truth hurts the people we love even more. If I don't get the chance to explain, I hope one day you understand why I stayed silent. I loved you until the very end. Eleanor held the letter against her chest. For 31 years, she had believed she knew every part of Daniel's life. Now she understood something important. Knowing someone's whole story isn't the same as knowing how deeply they loved you. Months later, Eleanor, Rebecca, and Sophie began meeting regularly. It wasn't easy. There were awkward conversations, painful memories, and many unanswered questions. But slowly, the two families stopped feeling like strangers. One afternoon, Sophie gave Eleanor a small photograph. It showed Daniel smiling between the two women he had spent his life trying to protect. On the back, Sophie had written, "Maybe we were never two families. Maybe we were just one family that took too long to find each other." Eleanor smiled through her tears. She placed the photograph beside Daniel's old birthday card. She no longer looked at that card with anger. She looked at it as the beginning of the truth. The truth had been painful. It had changed everything. But it had also given Eleanor something she never expected. A chance to know the part of Daniel's life she had never been allowed to see. And, most importantly, a chance to forgive him. Not because what he did was easy to accept, but because she finally understood why he did it. Daniel had spent his final years trying to protect the people he loved. In the end, the truth had finally brought them together. And Eleanor realized that sometimes the hardest thing to forgive isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's the silence of someone who is only trying to protect you. If you were Eleanor, would you forgive Daniel after discovering the real reason he kept his second family a secret, or would the years of silence be too difficult to forget?